Hello, everybody. Scott Golden here with the Golden Opportunities Coaching YouTube channel. Welcome to those of you who are new. Welcome back to those of you seasoned veterans of what we do around here. We got over 650 audios available on a variety of topics. If you're looking for tips on how to be a better parent, tips on how to be a better person, tips on life, relationships, business, whatever have you, I coach in all areas and am pretty happy with the fact that over the last 14 years, I've developed a system that will work for about 95 to 97% of people. There are people I don't connect with, and we refund those that exists with. If you are looking for somebody to work with, though, would love to be of assistance to you in that manner. Please feel free to reach out. There's a couple ways to do that. You can do it through Twitter at PO Perception, or you can do it in the About Me section of this particular webpage and connect in that way. The first thing we're going to kind of run through here is the idea of things that parents shouldn't say. So there's lots of things that parents say that are very harmful, and the psychology of developing a healthy self-esteem and self-talk begins as young as 4, 5, 6 years old. Whenever a kid starts to anchor memories, and so there are things that you just don't say to a child, and obviously a lot of people get kind of built into the heat of the moment and ultimately say things they later regret. It happens a lot more than we want it to, and you have to forgive yourself when it does, but still avoiding these things ultimately is a good idea. The first is telling a kid to grow up or be more mature. Look, kids have a lot of pressure today more than ever before. I think the standard of how quick a kid learns and all the things that come along with being a kid these days, it's much harder than it was 30, 50 years ago, certainly. And it's because the performance of children begins tracking, in early kindergarten, first grade, second grade. So the pressure to be grown and make adult decisions and not understanding that kids kind of emotionally metabolize, in other words, go through their emotions at a different rate than an adult would, can often make parents think that a kid should be grown. Look, there's enough pressure in adulthood for 10 herds of people. Sometimes being grown isn't, so harsh. And then the other is, the next thing in this is, why are you so messed up? Why do you act this way? What's wrong with you? Those type of accusatory things where parents are dissatisfied with a child's behavior, a child's word choice, a child's actions, or the way in which they respond and react to other people or certain situations. You got to realize a lot of times adults will expect a child to react the way that they would with their own maturity. So asking a kid why they're messed up or why they're acting negatively, that child often doesn't know how to behave. Instead, they may be scared, they may be frightened, they may be overstimulated, they may be dealing with emotions they don't know how to process. And so usually when a kid acts out, there's a reason behind it. It is the job of the parent to kind of dig a little bit and find out that reason. The next is, you are a reflection of me. Now, while this may be true by society's standards, how kids behave does reflect upon the parenting and parentage of these children. The problem with that is that's a lot of pressure for any kid to take on, whether they be a young preteen or a teenager. The pressure of you reflect me is something that no kid should have to deal with, because at the end of the day, these kids are still figuring out who they are. And when you put a kid's pressure to be a reflection of you, and they don't necessarily understand what makes you fully happy or you fully sad or frustrates you or leads you to dissatisfaction with them, then they're always just going to feel like no matter what they do, it's wrong, and that can lead to a lot of problems in the long and short run of it. The next thing is kind of looking at the idea of my rules, my house. This is so ridiculous because it's an interesting quandary. Now more than ever before, we are seeing people who are rules averse, right? There's issues with how people see politics. There's issues with how people see religions. There's issues with how people see police and the other and government and other authority figures. But here's the really difficult concept as it relates to how things go. There's some struggles with how to make sure that we know that kids follow rules. And the most common thing, and certainly was more common, I think, in previous generations of parents, kids that grew up in the 80s and 90s, heard the because I said so. I think parents are more conscious now than they were 20 or 30 years ago, because the generation that grew up in the 80s or 90s realized that because I said so often didn't work, but at the same time, because it's my rules is another version of that. If a kid doesn't understand the consequences of the rule, doesn't understand the benefit of the rule, obviously you can't do this with toddlers, but when a kid begins to understand reason, if they don't have a reason behind a rule, they're not going to follow it. The next is body shaming of children. Oh, you look horrible in that color, or oh, you're too fat, too thin, you don't smile enough, you this, you that, and it's hard enough to be a child in 2021 with so much bullying going on in schools. And I hope, maybe one of the good parts that comes from the pandemic and the challenges associated with the pandemic is kids had a break from bullying, and so maybe they will go back into environments in a more traditional brick and mortar physical school where there's less bullying. Maybe I'm being naive in that, and that's entirely possible. But my hope is that there's less bullying in general around that, and hopefully that the creation of that would make life easier for a lot of kids. But at the same time, when a parent makes comments about appearance that is critical, now obviously if a kid looks horrible in a color combination, you might gently say to them, I think you look even better wearing this. But it's all about framing and how things are framed and how words are said, and coming to a place of using a reframe as an opportunity to praise rather than condemn. And I think that's super important for kids that are at all points of the spectrum in terms of their own self-value and self-esteem. Then the next thing is that the parent had it tougher than the kid, and I think that's dropped a little bit. But at the same time, I think this is the first generation of kids in lots of Western culture that are growing up with parents who might have been in poverty their entire life and were dependent on social assistance services. I think maybe it's the second generation, but the idea that there were kids that were living in large quantities of kids that were living in poverty, and the poverty numbers have certainly changed over the last 2 or 3 generations in a negative downward trend, or that studying was harder, or that socialization was harder, or we didn't have technology and so that was harder. But the thing is what kids find hard today is just as important as to them as what the previous generation found hard in their day. It's frame of reference related. So when you say to a kid, I had it tougher than you, what you're really saying is, I don't think that your experience matters as much as mine does. And that point of separation makes kids feel invalidated and eventually is going to shut them down from talking. And obviously, most teenagers don't need a reason to stop talking to adults and authority figures. It's part of the territory. But giving a kid an extra reason, really not a good idea. The next thing is telling a kid that they were an accident, or that they, were unwanted, unplanned. A lot of people, especially these days, do have children that are unplanned pregnancies, or the result of a casual relationship, or the result of failed contraceptives, or whatever the case may be. The kid doesn't need to carry that. And it's super toxic to say to a kid that they weren't wanted, because now it's like, well, I'm the reason for your stress. I'm the reason for your burden. And I'm sure every parent, or almost every parent, many parents who are at the brink of regretting their decision for children, which I think is one thing that's underspoken in society, especially for women, but also, there are many men who just parenthood wasn't for them, but they wound up there anyway, and actions and consequences aren't something that they were thinking through clearly at the time. And so they wind up with kids that they never planned on, and that is horrible. And I think we as a society need to do better about making adoption and other community raising options available to parents. And also, we need to change the culture around speaking out against not desiring to be parental. I think we need to change that because if we did, mental health issues would be less, I truly believe. I think also that child abuse and neglect would be less if people could say, you know what, parenthood isn't for me. There's a million reasons, but suffice to say, these are things that parents need to avoid saying. And I hope that this is helpful. Please feel free to reach out. If I can be of assistance in any way, keep your feet on the ground, your mind in the moment. Until next time, everybody.